At 30,000 feet, a plane full of strangers was trapped in chaos until a boy no one noticed stood up, stepped forward, and changed every life on board. The night sky stretched endlessly above the transatlantic jet, as though the universe itself had opened a deep, star-vaulted corridor, a road of shimmering quiet meant only for those bold enough to traverse it. Yet the serenity outside was mocked by the chaos inside, where a 6-month-old infant's piercing cries filled the aircraft like a distress call echoing across a canyon, sharp enough to fray nerves and twist tempers. Tech billionaire Richard Whittaker sat isolated in the polished perfection of first class, feeling anything but privileged, his designer suit wrinkled, his hair mussed and sticking to the sheen of sweat collecting on his forehead, his breath shallow with the panic only parents of a suffering infant know, cradling baby Emma in trembling arms as though he could shield her from pain simply by the strength of his hold. 3 hours had passed, 3 hours of desperate rocking, whispered lullabies in languages he barely remembered, brand new pacifiers unwrapped with frantic hands, soft blankets tucked and retucked, bottles warmed and re-warmed, bouncing from seat to aisle and back again, with absolutely nothing bringing relief. Around him, the illusion of luxury had evaporated. The crystal champagne glasses trembled with irritated fingers, silk suits were fluffed in impatience, and designer headphones pressed harder against wealthy ears, attempting to drown out the sound that no barrier could silence. Flight attendants wearing masks of professional calm walked briskly, their panic confined to their eyes, and whispered amongst themselves about the complaints stacking like delayed luggage. A man in a white blazer muttered loudly about people like this, and a woman demanded, not quite quietly, that billionaire fathers ought to afford private jets if their offspring couldn't be trained to behave. Richard felt each remark land like a blow, felt the crushing irony that a man who commanded rooms of executives, who stood unshaken before critics and governments alike, now cowered under the judgment of strangers because the one soul whose comfort mattered most would not stop crying. Yet the reason was simple. Emma was scared. The air pressure hurt her ears, unfamiliar vibrations rattled her small bones, and everything, the lights, the voices, the sealed metallic world around her, felt like a place she wasn't meant to be. She cried because it was the only thing she could do. But logic is cold comfort to a father unraveling. Richard's lungs tightened, grief rippling through him as though each cry reminded him of every failure he had spent a lifetime burying. He had been a child once, too, frightened, alone, raised by nannies and tutors more than parents, his childhood sculpted into a polished resume. He had sworn his daughter would have better. Yet here he was, in a seat worth more than some family's yearly income, completely unable to provide the only thing she needed, comfort. And while first class simmered with resentment like a pot at boil, deep in economy class, where space shrank to the width of one's shoulders and the air tasted faintly recycled, sat 16-year-old Noah Simon. His seat, 42F, felt cramped, but he barely noticed. He had grown used to tight corners, whether it was the narrow apartment in Chicago's South Side with its flickering hallway light or the cafeteria table he shared at school with no one. Noah had always been quiet, a boy whose presence was often treated like a misplaced object, glanced over, stepped around, useful only when someone needed answers on homework. His clothes were worn, his backpack frayed, the straps nearly tearing, and his shoes were handed down from a cousin who had long since moved away. He clutched his backpack close, not because of its material worth, but because inside it were the only things that made him feel safe. His notebooks filled with numbers and equations that made sense even when life did not, and a small hand-carved mobile he had made for his little sister before she passed away, before illness stole her breath and with it part of his own. Noah did not sleep. He never slept easily. He listened to the crying that never stopped, sounds that blended into memories of his sister's hospital bed, the beeping machines, the helplessness, the goodbyes. He closed his eyes and breathed, and the sound didn't fade. Instead, it grew. It called. He watched fellow passengers shift in annoyance, watched people glare as though a baby owed them silence. And the idea formed inside him slowly, courage laced into its edges like golden thread. He unbuckled his seatbelt, though his hands trembled, because he knew how people reacted when boys like him walked where they didn't belong. But he stood anyway and held his backpack to his chest like armor, walking down the aisle as if the carpet beneath his steps was a bridge over water, and he alone could fall. People stared. A few whispered. One scoffed. But something strange also happened. Curiosity softened edges of disdain. When he reached the curtain dividing worlds, economy from first class, his breath caught in his throat. But he stepped forward, only to be gently stopped by a flight attendant who held out a perfectly manicured hand. "Sir," she said, professional warmth masking confusion, "this area is restricted to first-class passengers." Noah's voice came quiet, as though he feared breaking itself. I think I can help the baby." Richard, who had long ceased to hear anything but Emma's cries, looked up then. His eyes were rimmed red, dark crescents beneath them mapping exhaustion. For a moment, he didn't see a stranger. He saw a lifeline, however impossible. "Anything," he whispered hoarsely, his voice cracking like dry wood. "Anything, please." The flight attendant hesitated, but stepped aside, and Noah walked the final steps toward Richard, slowly lowering himself into the seat beside him. He opened his backpack carefully, reverently, and pulled out the small wooden mobile, a fragile constellation of carved stars and moons, hung by thread. Imperfect, soft edges made by hands that learned through trial, failure, patience. "My sister," Noah whispered, his gaze softening with memory. "She used to cry like this, loud, hurting, until she had something steady to look at. Something that moved like a night sky, something that told her she wasn't alone." Richard's breath caught. No one else spoke. The plane itself seemed to hush. Noah lifted the mobile above Emma's face and began to hum, not a song anyone recognized, but something ancient in feeling, a tune shaped like comfort and sunlight and lullabies made of memory. He hummed quietly, steadily, his voice barely more than breath, yet it filled the air like warmth. The stars and moon gently swayed, left, right, like waves. Emma's cries faltered, then paused, then stopped. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, like a held breath released. Emma's eyelids, fluttering like wings, lowered, and her tiny body relaxed, her fist unclenching, her face softening into sleep. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then a whisper, "He did it," rolled through the cabin. One clap, then another. Then applause broke like a storm of gratitude, like thunder across the sky. People smiled at a stranger they had moments before dismissed. Even the woman in first class whose complaint had been loudest now wept, overcome by something she didn't expect to feel. Humility. Richard stared at Noah, not at his worn-down shoes or the frayed backpack, but at the courage and gentleness he carried like rare treasure. "Thank you," he said, and this time his voice did not break. It steadied. "Noah, thank you." Noah shrugged lightly, though emotion glimmered in his eyes like a hidden sun. "Sometimes," he murmured, "people just need something steady to look at." The plane dimmed into the soft blue wash of midnight lighting, passengers finally resting, and Richard remained awake, not crushed by exhaustion but lifted by awe, watching the boy who had soothed his daughter with nothing more than wood, thread, and heart. He thought of the world he lived in, a world where value was measured in money, where worth was weighed by title and power, and he realized how small that world truly was. He turned to Noah again, curiosity shifting into something like admiration. "You said your sister," he began. He didn't finish. Noah nodded, his gaze lowered. "When she died, I thought all I had left was pain, so I made this mobile, to remember that somewhere, stars are still moving." Richard looked at the mobile, at the wooden stars, and felt something shift inside him. A seed. A promise. He rested a hand on Noah's shoulder, not out of pity, out of recognition. Two people from opposite worlds, one who had everything and one who had lost too much, met in a moment where only love mattered. Outside the window, stars shimmered across the dark ocean sky as though the universe itself watched and approved. The engines hummed, the baby slept, and the world, for just that moment, was gentle. And as Noah finally closed his eyes, resting for the first time since the journey began, Richard whispered into the darkness, not to be heard, but because truth demanded breath. "Sometimes the richest person in the room isn't the one with the most money." And the plane flew forward through night, carrying hundreds of souls in a metal body suspended between continents, but carrying something far more fragile and far more powerful within its walls. The reminder that compassion is a light that requires no fuel, no wealth, only a heart willing to shine. And as dawn began its slow creep over the horizon, painting gold over cloud tops like the beginning of a new promise, Richard looked at his daughter, then at the boy who had held the night steady, and understood. Some journeys change your destination, but others change your life.